What if the most destabilizing things in your life, the insults, the losses, the failures, the uncertainty, genuinely had no power over you? Not as a spiritual ideal, not as a distant possibility you worked toward for years, but as a real, practical state of mind you can begin building today, using tools that have already been proven across 25 centuries of human hardship. That's what Stoicism actually is. Not a mood, not a trend, a precision system for living. Road-tested by slaves, emperors, soldiers, and exiles who faced circumstances that would break most of us and found a peace that nothing outside them could take away. Today, we're going to move through 10 of the most powerful principles in that system. Principles drawn primarily from the teachings of Epictetus, a man born without freedom and who became one of the freest human beings in recorded history. Each principle is a tool. Each tool is usable today, and they build on each other. So stay with me all the way through, because the 10th one ties everything together in a way that might genuinely change something for you. But before we get to principle 1, there's something you need to understand about why most people never find real inner peace. And it has nothing to do with how hard their life is. Most of us have been chasing peace in exactly the wrong place. We spend our energy, our attention, our anxiety, our constant effort trying to manage what's outside us, other people's opinions, the economy, the behavior of people we love, the news cycle, the weather, and every time the external world doesn't cooperate, which it does constantly because the external world doesn't care about your plans, we feel like we've failed. The Stoics looked at this pattern and diagnosed it clearly. The problem isn't the world. The problem is the misallocation of effort. You are pouring energy into territory you don't own. The territory you do own, your mind, your judgments, your responses, your character, you're barely touching. These 10 principles are a map for taking that territory back. Before we begin, if this kind of content, the kind that changes how you actually think, not just how you feel for 12 minutes, matters to you, subscribe to Stoic Sight. This channel exists to bring this level of depth to you regularly. Now let's go. Principle 1. Anchor your life to a purpose that holds. Imagine launching a boat without setting a destination. You push off from shore and immediately the currents begin moving you. Then the wind shifts. Then another current. You're not sailing, you're drifting. And you can dress it up however you like. Call it going with the flow. Name it spontaneity. But what it actually is directionlessness. And a directionless life is a life that external forces shape for you because you haven't shaped it yourself. Epictetus was relentless on this point. He taught that a person who knows what they're truly living for carries something that circumstances cannot reach. Not invincibility, but a kind of orientation that holds even when everything around them is shifting. That orientation is what he called a firm purpose. And it's not what most people think it is. Here's the distinction. Most motivational content quietly glosses over the difference between a purpose and a preference. A preference is what you want when things are comfortable. A purpose is what you hold on to when things are hard. A preference softens under pressure. A purpose stiffens. And almost everyone walking around today has preferences they've mistaken for purposes. And they discover the difference the moment life applies real heat. So how do you locate a genuine purpose? Epictetus would tell you to stop looking outward and start excavating inward. Not your career ambitions, though those can be part of it. Not your 5-year plan. Deeper. What kind of person do you want to be remembered as? What values would you defend even if no one was watching? Even if there was no reward? Now, even if it cost you something significant? The answers to those questions aren't just self-help exercises. They're the structural material of real purpose. And once you find them, something shifts. The mountain that was blocking your road begins to function differently, not as an obstacle, but as a test of who you actually are. Your purpose isn't what you chase, it's what you refuse to abandon. A firm purpose functions like a lighthouse. It doesn't calm the storm. It gives you a fixed reference point inside the storm. And that reference point changes everything about how you navigate. The challenge that would have derailed you last year becomes a step because you now know what direction you're moving. The setback that would have felt final becomes a detour because the destination is still clear. Write it down. Speak it out loud. You return to it when the noise gets deafening. Let it function less like a vision board goal and more like a vertebra, something that holds the structure of your life upright from the inside. Once your purpose is anchored, the next critical task is learning to guard something that most people leave completely undefended. That's where Principle 2 begins. Principle 2. Become the deliberate gatekeeper of your own mind. Your mind is not just something that happens to you. It is a space. And like any space, your home, your office, your body, what you allow inside determines what grows there. Leave a space unguarded and things settle in that you never chose. Clutter accumulates, noise occupies the corners, and before long, the space no longer feels like yours. Most people treat their minds exactly like this, unguarded. They open to whatever arrives. Someone says something cutting and it takes up residence in their thoughts for days. A news story triggers anxiety and it camps there, quietly draining. A comparison with someone else's life silently poisons an otherwise good afternoon. All of it automatic, all of it unconscious, because the decision to be deliberate was never made. Epictetus didn't speak in the language of modern neuroscience, but his insight maps perfectly onto what neuroscience now confirms. You are not simply your thoughts. You are the observer of your thoughts, and the observer has authority. The ability to engage, challenge, redirect, or show a thought out of the building entirely. The way you develop this authority is through a practice that sounds almost too simple. Winning small battles over your own impulses every single day. You resist one petty craving. Delay one reactive response by 30 seconds. Sit with a moment of discomfort instead of immediately reaching for a screen. Each of these acts, as minor as they sound, is a training repetition for the mind you're building, one that responds from intention rather than reflex, that chooses rather than simply follows the path of least resistance. Think of the baker who puts their complete attention on the quality of the bread, not on whether this customer praised it or that critic dismissed it, not on what the baker across the street is doing, solely on the craft in front of them. That laser focus is not limitation, it is liberation, because they've decided what matters and they guard that decision against everything that doesn't. Guard what enters your mind the way you guard what enters your home. The practical tools for this are real and accessible. Mindfulness practices, even 5 focused minutes each morning, train the mind to observe rather than automatically react. A growth mindset reframes adversity as information rather than attack. Curating your inputs, the media you consume, the conversations you choose, the people you spend time around, changes the texture of what enters your mental space without you even having to fight for it. Resilience built this way isn't brittle. It doesn't depend on good days or favorable circumstances. It's an internal architecture built brick by brick from deliberate choices that holds even when everything outside is loud and chaotic. But even the most guarded mind will face one thing it cannot fully control: the judgments of other people. Now, and how you handle those judgments is the subject of the third principle. Principle 3, understand yourself so deeply that criticism loses its power. Epictetus offered an observation that sounds almost too clean, until you actually test it against your own life. Criticism from another person can only wound you if you surrender the authority to let it. What someone says about you is not the injury. Your internal verdict on what they said, your decision about whether their words are true, whether they matter, whether they have the right to land. That's where the actual impact either happens or doesn't. This means you are never purely a passive recipient. You are always the final interpreter of your own experience, and the mechanism that gives you access to that role is self-knowledge. When you understand your own motivations with real clarity, when you know why you made a decision, what you were trying to do, what values you were acting from, the external critique finds very little traction. You've already evaluated yourself by a standard that you respect. Someone else's version of the verdict carries proportionally less weight. But if there's unresolved uncertainty in you, if you're not sure whether you acted with integrity, whether your reasoning was sound, whether your choice was right, that's exactly when criticism cuts to the bone. Not because the critic is necessarily correct, but because their words found the gap between what you did and what you know you should have done. This means that building resilience to criticism is not primarily about developing harder skin. It's about developing a more accurate, honest, grounded understanding of yourself. And that's actually better news, because skin hardening is passive and brittle, while self-knowledge is active and grows with practice. Stoicism insists you not dismiss all criticism reflexively. The Stoic move is more nuanced. Pause, genuinely examine the feedback, and ask whether it contains anything useful. Even badly delivered criticism can carry a grain of legitimate insight. The wise person extracts it and discards the delivery method. Patience is the companion skill. The kind that understands most criticism is filtered through the critic's own fears and limited information. Knowing this doesn't make you dismissive. It makes you more accurate in assessing what they say. Criticism, at least, is usually some form of engagement. But sometimes what we face is more personal than that. Someone doesn't just disagree with you, they deliberately offend you. The fourth principle addresses that with unflinching directness. Principle 4. Convert every offense into an instrument of inner growth. Every offense is a test. And like most meaningful tests, it has a right answer. One that most people never find because they're too busy reacting to look for it. When someone offends you, says something contemptuous, dismissive, openly cruel, or subtly cutting, the human instinct is immediate and overwhelming. Retaliate, withdraw, collapse, or explode. Every one of these responses has one thing in common. They all hand control of your inner state to someone else. The offender doesn't just get to offend you, they get to steer you. And they've driven you somewhere that serves them, not you. Epictetus was direct about this. Events are neutral. They carry no inherent emotional charge. It is your interpretation of events, the meaning you assign them, the story you build around them, that generates your emotional experience, which means that the offender's actual power over you is far more limited than it feels in the moment. And the gap between what they did and how it affects you is yours to manage. Now, none of this means you pretend you weren't hurt. You were. Let that be true. Stoicism is not about building a wall between yourself and your emotions. It's about building a space between feeling something and being governed by it. That space, the quiet interval between the stimulus and your response, is where all your real agency lives. In the immediate reaction, you have almost no freedom. In the pause, you have enormous freedom. The Stoic practice is simply learning to take that pause on purpose every time. A practical technique. Instead of centering your experience by asking, "Why did they do this to me?" ask, "What can I understand or learn from this encounter?" This doesn't exonerate the offender. It just shifts your posture from victim of the moment to student of it. And students, over time, get smarter. Victims stay stuck. Empathy serves here in a way most people don't expect. When you genuinely ask yourself what someone might be carrying that led them to behave the way they did, you don't excuse the behavior, but you depersonalize it. Most cruelty isn't actually about you. It's about the person being cruel. Recognizing this is not naive, it's liberating. And then there is forgiveness, the most practically powerful and widely misunderstood idea in Stoicism. Forgiveness is not something you extend to someone else. It's something you grant yourself. Holding on to resentment does not punish the person who wronged you. It burns energy you need for everything else. Releasing that weight is not softness. It is, in fact, deeply strategic. The fifth principle ventures into territory that most people rarely examine honestly: the deep interior emotions of fear and shame. Principle 5. Face fear and shame with courage and compassion. Epictetus articulated something that philosophers have debated and psychologists have since confirmed. We are not afraid of events themselves. We are afraid of our own interpretations of events. The situation carries no inherent terror. We construct the terror and project it onto the situation, which means fear is not a fixed external force. It's an internal creation. And anything we create, we can examine, dismantle, and rebuild differently. Consider one of the most statistically common fears in the world: public speaking. What is the person actually afraid of? Not the microphone, not the room. They're afraid of being judged insufficient, of the audience deciding they don't measure up. But examine that fear honestly. Break it into its real components, and it starts to shrink. The audience isn't a tribunal. They're human beings, most of whom want you to succeed. Because watching someone succeed is more enjoyable than watching someone fail. And even if you stumble, which humans do and always will, the consequence is survivable. Always. The Stoic method for approaching fear is called premeditatio, the clear-eyed examination of what you fear before you face it, not to amplify it, but to demystify it, to reduce a formless anxiety to specific, manageable concerns you can actually address. Shame is a different animal and requires a different approach. Fear says, "This situation is dangerous." Shame says, "I am defective." It's the deepest form of self-attack, the internal verdict that you are not just someone who made a mistake, but someone who is a mistake. And it thrives in silence, growing more powerful the longer it remains unexamined and unspoken. The Stoic answer to shame is not suppression, pushing it down and pretending it isn't there. And it's not self-punishment, endlessly reviewing the thing you did wrong as if that creates penance. The answer is honest, courageous self-compassion, the kind that says, "I see what happened, I understand it, I take responsibility for it, I learn from it, and I release the right to have it define me permanently." Self-forgiveness in this context is not an escape hatch from accountability. It is the very prerequisite for genuine growth. You cannot improve what you refuse to examine, but you also cannot grow while you're drowning in guilt about something you've already learned from. The Stoics understood that guilt is useful exactly long enough to generate the lesson, and toxic the moment it extends beyond that. One of the most underestimated tools in this practice is community. Sharing your fears with one person who genuinely won't flinch is an act of courage that almost always reduces the fear itself. When you speak the thing aloud, even once, to one trusted person, it loses authority. The monsters in the unlit corner are almost always smaller than they seemed in the dark. Even when fear is managed and shame is processed, life has another weapon in its arsenal, the completely unexpected. The sixth principle is about neutralizing that weapon before it's used. Principle 6. Premeditate adversity before it arrives. The Stoics had a specific practice they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. On the surface, it sounds like a recipe for anxiety. In practice, it is one of the most powerful resilience tools ever developed. The practice is simple. Before a significant event or challenge, take a few deliberate minutes to honestly imagine what could go wrong. Not catastrophically, not spiraling, just honestly. What obstacles might appear, what might fail, what might you feel? And then, what would you do? How would you respond? What resources and skills do you have access to? What have you already survived that was harder than this? This exercise doesn't create pessimism, it creates immunity. When you've already walked through the scenario inside your own mind, when you've felt the discomfort of the imagined failure and found your way through it, the real version doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as something you've already rehearsed. Think about what happens to a surgeon who has practiced a procedure in simulation hundreds of times before performing it live. When complications arise, and in surgery, complications are never entirely avoidable. They don't freeze. They execute the response they've already internalized. That's not luck. That's preparation made visible. You can apply the same principle at every scale. Before a difficult conversation, run through how it might go sideways and prepare your grounded response. Before a high-stakes presentation, imagine the hardest questions you might face and form your clear answers in advance. Before a significant change in your life, sit with what you're afraid might happen and engage with it honestly, rather than suppressing it and hoping it doesn't surface at the worst moment. This practice is not worry. Worry is unstructured, passive, and circular. It returns repeatedly to the same fears without ever processing them. Premeditatio is structured, active, and progressive. It moves through the fear rather than around it. The difference between a ship that sees the storm and trims its sails early and one caught with full canvas in a gale is premeditation. Same storm, different outcomes. Flexibility is the companion discipline here, because even the most carefully prepared plan meets the actual world and requires adjustment. The person who anticipated obstacles isn't rigid, they're ready. They've already practiced letting go of the idealized version when reality demands the adapted version. This mental agility is itself a Stoic virtue. Knowing what's coming is valuable, but that knowledge only serves you if you've also built what the seventh principle develops: inner strength that doesn't depend on favorable conditions. Principle 7. Build an inner life that stands without outside support. Epictetus stated what is probably the most quoted formulation in all of Stoicism. It is not what happens to you, but what you do with it that determines the quality of your life. And he didn't say it from comfort. He said it as a man who had been enslaved, who was physically disabled, who was denied property and status and freedom by every external metric available, and who nonetheless achieved a state of genuine inner freedom that most people with every advantage never approach. The lesson is not that suffering is fine. The lesson is that your inner life, the quality of your mind, your judgments, your character, is not actually contingent on your circumstances. It is available to be cultivated right now, regardless of what's happening around you. The inner strength is not the absence of difficulty. It is the presence of something within that can hold steady despite difficulty, and it is not built in grand public moments of dramatic courage, though those happen. It is built in the small, unwatched moments. The moment you keep a commitment when breaking it would be easier. The moment you choose not to say the cutting thing that would feel good for 6 seconds and damage something for 6 months. The moment you sit with real discomfort instead of immediately numbing it with whatever distraction is nearest. Self-awareness is the bedrock of all of this. You cannot manage what you cannot see. That means honest, regular examination of your own emotional patterns. What triggers your worst responses? What sends you into reactive mode before reason can arrive? What makes you contract or lash out? Not to judge yourself, but to catch it earlier next time, and then earlier still, until the interval between trigger and response grows wide enough to hold a deliberate choice. That widening is the actual work, and it compounds. The Stoic distinction between what is within your control and what is not remains the most immediately practical idea in this entire philosophy. Other people's choices, not yours. Your response to those choices, entirely yours. Economic conditions, not yours. Your effort, your character, your integrity within those conditions, entirely yours. This is not resignation to circumstances. It is the precise allocation of your energy to territory where it can actually do something. Gratitude functions as a form of inner strength training. When you regularly focus on what you genuinely have, not comparatively, not defensively, but with honest acknowledgement, you shift the center of gravity of your attention away from scarcity and toward richness. And that shift, practiced consistently, changes what you notice, changes what you experience, changes what you're capable of. The eighth principle might catch you off guard because it addresses something that seems simple but is, in practice, one of the most challenging things a human being can master. Principle 8. Govern the space between impulse and action. In every charged moment, there is a pause available to you. Most people never take it because most people have never been taught to look for it. Someone cuts you off in heavy traffic. The impulse is instant and overwhelming. Horn, gesture, words you can't take back. But stop and examine what acting on that impulse actually delivers. 30 seconds of release, followed by elevated stress hormones that you carry for the next 20 minutes. Your blood pressure is up. Your mood is darkened. Your next 10 interactions are subtly colored by the residue. The person who cut you off is already 3 exits away, completely unaffected. You didn't win anything. You borrowed trouble from yourself and distributed the interest to everyone you encounter afterward. Epictetus was profoundly interested in the relationship between impulse and action, specifically in the question of whether our actions are generated by reason or reflex. His conclusion was precise. Most human suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from what we do in the immediate aftermath, before reason has had a chance to arrive. The pause is where reason lives, and reason is where freedom lives. This principle extends to speech with particular urgency, because speech may be the area where impulsivity causes the most lasting damage. Words released in anger have a half-life that extends far beyond the moment of speaking. Relationships fractured by one reactive sentence. Opportunities foreclosed because you said the honest thing without the thoughtful thing alongside it. The Stoic practice of guarding your words rests on something simple. Once words leave you, they cannot be recalled. The pause before speaking is not hesitation. It is the exercise of real power. The question before speaking in a charged moment is, what I'm about to say something I'll still stand behind tomorrow morning? If uncertain, wait. This practice applies equally to decisions, especially the kind that feel urgent and are often not. We live in an environment expertly engineered to extract immediate responses from us. Buy now, react now, respond now, decide now. Stoicism is quietly but firmly countercultural on this. The long view is almost always more valuable than the immediate satisfaction. The discipline to hold the long view, even when everything in the moment is pulling toward the short one, is one of the most valuable things you can develop. Daily reflection accelerates all of this dramatically. Each evening, even 5 minutes, ask yourself, Where did I act from impulse instead of intention today? Where did urgency override wisdom? Not to punish yourself, but to update your understanding of your own patterns. Over time, the patterns shift. The pause comes more naturally. The wisdom arrives faster. The charged moments lose their automatic grip. All of that restraint ultimately rests on something even more foundational. The ninth principle addresses the one internal movement that makes every other principle actually workable. Principle 9, accept reality completely, then build from exactly there. There is a particular category of suffering that has almost nothing to do with what's actually happening and everything to do with the argument you're having inside yourself about what's happening. The situation is real. You are furious that it is real. And that fury, that sustained internal argument with reality, is now a second problem layered directly on top of the original one. You're managing both at once, and the second one is entirely self-generated. The Stoics called this resistance, and they identified it as one of the primary engines of unnecessary human misery, the kind that isn't caused by events themselves, but by the refusal to accept events as they are. Acceptance in Stoic terms is not surrender. It is not indifference. It is the act of seeing clearly, releasing the portion of your energy that is currently arguing with reality so that it becomes available for responding to reality. The difference is everything. Consider the person who loses their job. The loss itself is painful, genuinely, appropriately painful, but there are two distinct paths through it. One involves weeks of immobility, driven by the inability to stop arguing internally with the fact that it happened. The other involves acknowledging the loss fully, letting the hurt be real, and then asking the question that actually moves things forward. Given that this is real, what do I do now? The second path is acceptance. It doesn't minimize the pain. It refuses to let the pain become the entire story. It doesn't pretend the difficulty isn't there. It decides that the difficulty isn't the final word. Perfectionism is acceptance's most persistent enemy. The belief that things should be cleaner, more resolved, more aligned with what you had planned, keeps a person in continuous low-grade friction with reality. Stoicism doesn't say lower your standards. It says honor the gap between your vision and your current reality without being paralyzed by it. Imperfection is the natural texture of a life actually being lived. Embracing that honestly, rather than fighting it with resentment, is one of the most liberating adjustments you can make. Gratitude is acceptance in its most active, constructive form. When you genuinely look at what you have, not defensively, not comparatively, the present moment almost always turns out to be richer than your anxiety suggested. Regular, honest gratitude shifts your default orientation from scarcity to abundance. It doesn't resolve problems, but it changes the state from which you approach them. Acceptance also changes how we relate to other people. When we carry rigid expectations of how others should behave, every deviation becomes a fresh grievance. Releasing those expectations doesn't mean abandoning standards or tolerating harm. It means understanding that every person is on their own journey, but carrying their own weight, making their own mistakes, exactly as you are. Responding from that understanding creates entirely different relationships. The 10th principle draws all of this together into something sweeping and fundamental. A question not just about how you manage adversity, but about how you inhabit your life at the deepest level. Principle 10. Live according to your nature, rational, social, and whole. The Stoics held that every human being has a nature, and that genuine flourishing comes from living in alignment with that nature, not in opposition to it or in ignorance of it. For them, human nature has two essential dimensions, rational and social. Rational means you have the capacity to think, reflect, deliberate, and choose, to live from values rather than instinct, to make decisions your future self will respect, so to respond rather than react, to take the long view when every short-term signal points elsewhere. Living rationally doesn't mean living emotionlessly. It means letting your reason make the final call. Social means you are not a self-contained unit. You are woven into a network of relationships, immediate and extended, personal and civic, present and inherited. The Stoics saw this not as a burden to be managed, but as an essential part of what gives life meaning. You are part of something larger than yourself, and contributing to that larger something is not a sacrifice of your interests. It is an expression of your deepest nature. This is where the four foundational virtues of Stoic philosophy become operational rather than merely decorative. Wisdom, the ability to perceive clearly and act appropriately, even when the situation is complex. Courage, the willingness to act rightly despite fear, opposition, or cost. Justice, the commitment to treating others fairly, honestly, and with genuine dignity, not because it benefits you, but because it is right. Temperance, the discipline to stay balanced and measured rather than swinging to extremes of excess or deprivation. These virtues are not passive ideals, they are active filters. Run your decisions through them. Is this choice wise given everything I actually know? Is it courageous, or am I avoiding something? Is it just to everyone it affects? Is it measured and sustainable? If yes, proceed with confidence. If not, sit with it longer. Living according to your nature also involves embracing simplicity, not in an austere, joyless way, but in the sense of cutting away what doesn't genuinely add to your life, so that what truly matters becomes more visible. The Stoics were consistently suspicious of accumulation, of possessions, of busyness, of obligations that drain without feeding. The question they would pose today is not, what else can I add? But what can I honestly release so that the essential becomes clear? There is one more dimension to this principle that we often overlook: the relationship with the natural world itself. The Stoics felt genuine kinship with the larger cosmos, a sense of being small, purposeful parts of something vast and ordered. When you feel yourself collapsing under a particular struggle, the Stoic invitation is to zoom out. You are a human being on a planet of enormous age, in a universe of incomprehensible scale. Your problem is real, and in the largest possible frame, it occupies a specific, bounded space. That perspective doesn't minimize your suffering, it gives you room to breathe around it. Mindfulness, the capacity to be present, to observe your own processes without being automatically swept into them, is the thread that connects all 10 of these principles. Without presence, every principle remains theoretical. With it, they become a living practice that accumulates in you over time, quietly but unmistakably. So there they are. 10 principles developed and tested by people who faced circumstances that would break most of us. A man born into slavery who became one of history's most influential teachers. Emperors who chose philosophical discipline over luxury and excess. Thinkers who went into exile and came back with their equanimity intact. None of them found peace by controlling the world. They found it by mastering themselves. And the most important thing Stoicism insists on, this path is not reserved for exceptional people. It is not gated behind special circumstances or the right kind of life. It is open right now, exactly as things are, with what you currently have. So let me ask you directly, which of these 10 principles do you most need in your life right now? Put it in the comments. I read every one of them, and your answer genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If something in this video shifted the way you see something, even something small, hit like on this video. It takes 1 second and it helps Stoic Sight reach more people who need exactly this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We go this deep every time. Peace is not the absence of chaos. It is the presence of a trained and steady mind. Stay grounded, think clearly, and live according to what you know is true.